Today's news from PSA, whilst is amazing from a competition lens, is honestly ridiculous because it makes them look incredibly hypocritical and once again highlights maybe why they shouldn't be considered the best when it comes to grading collectibles and the like. And I want to share my thoughts on this today because it is a very, very interesting one. Now, like you probably saw by the title, this does in fact relate to the news that PSA have announced they're going to go ahead and start grading comic books and magazines in 2025. This is a pretty big deal, and whilst it does relate to comic books and magazines, like I just said, this channel does cover collectibles. But the point I want to talk to about the hypocrisy from PSA relates to cards, because they've taken a stance here when it comes to altering cards they're now offering as a service that they're still saying is a big no-no for cards themselves. And I want to unpack that, a little bit further, and that's the main point for today. Now, like you can sort of see on screen, and I just alluded to, they are going to go ahead and start grading comic books and magazines. This is what it's going to look like. I think it's really good from a competition perspective. As we spoke to in my last video with CGC partnering with JSA, we want more autograph authentication happening in this space. So that was really, really good. This is for the same reasons, because you mainly have CGC from a comic book perspective. Yeah, you have CBCS, which I believe is owned by Beckett. They're not really doing too much in terms of gaining credibility. So it's sort of cool to see, a company with as much money as PSA basically coming into this market that's actually going to challenge, CGC quite hard. And whilst I think this is a very cool move from PSA, I'm really curious to see whether or not they have the capability to actually do this kind of grading. My understanding is they've partnered with a big time comic dealer that's well known within the industry. So maybe they're going to get some expertise through that, or not maybe, they will. But it's chalk and cheese going from grading cards to comic books, and they need to be a bit careful because, you're no longer just looking at the front or the back or the centering or the edges or the corners. You now need to look at, a lot more things, because comic books have multiple pages, obviously. They have staples that also need to be looked at. You need to make sure that the coupons haven't been cut out. You need to make sure there's no pages missing. You need to make sure that the pages are consistent, there's no rips in them. You got to look for a heck of a lot more things. So, if PSA want to take the approach they have with cards over the last couple of years, where they're looking at primarily pumping things out, rumors around them spending a few minutes looking at a card itself and grading it, they're not going to do too well in this space, because whilst, CGC have a heck of a lot of issues in terms of comic book grading, they've earned their name for a specific reason. And it's a lot easier for CGC to go from comic books and enter into cards like they have than the other way around. So I'm really curious to see how successful PSA is going to be, and whether or not they try and treat it with the same disdain they've given us as card collectors, because you guys can say all you want about them being the best in terms of the most value. But they've done a heck of a lot of shady things, in particular around upcharges and rejecting genuine cards and all that kind of stuff, purely because they're trying to process things as fast as possible. And when it comes time to things like a third-party grader, it needs to be all about integrity, in my opinion. So they can't be treating this with the disrespect, because, CGC are already doing a heck of a really good job. And like I said, it's harder to go from cards to comics than comics to cards. But the piece here that is super interesting, and why it's probably relevant to you guys as card collectors, is, what they're basically doing with this process. They've talked about not just grading comic books and magazines, but they're also going to start offering pressing as a service. And the regulars on the channel will know that we've talked about card collating so many times on this. We've talked about Kurt's Card Care amongst others. And you will know that we've always made a reference back to what happens in comic books, because certain things are okay from a comic book perspective. So people would sit back and say, well, you can clean comic books, you can press comic books, why can't you do that to cards? And that's where the talking point comes to today. Pressing, if you're not sure what it is, it's basically where they put the book in between, a heavy press, and they squish it down, and it sort of flattens the book out to remove dents, dimples, creases. It actually makes the book a heck of a lot crispier, and the spine looks brand new. And this is happening with older books too. It's amazing what can sort of happen with that. And it's something that I've never been a huge fan of, and it's something that CGC historically was saying it was a no-no. And then with enough pressure, they started actually offering it as a service, because they saw, well, people are actually doing this, we may as well make some money from it. And that's where, the interesting talking point comes today, because PSA are basically going to say they're doing the same thing. And, it's briefly mentioned here on their website, where they're talking about, how in 2025, this is when this stuff is going to come into an effect. But PSA will begin a new chapter in its heritage-rich history with the introduction of comic book and magazine authentication and grading, along with comic book and magazine pressing, which is sort of really funny to have this come from PSA, because you guys will know the stance they've had recently when it comes to the likes of Kurt's Card Care and them coming out and further reiterating that that stuff is not okay. Anytime you add a substance to a card, it's considered altering and they don't condone it. The same thing goes when it comes to pressing, because people have tried to talk about that from a comic book, from a sports card perspective, I should say. Apologies for that. And they've said it's a no-no. So it's just interesting to see them starting to offer this as a service. And that's where the hypocrisy comes in. Because irrespective of what PSA has done in the past or what CGC has done in the past, PSA have recently come out and made a stance and reiterated it in recent months about card cleaning and said all those things that I just said. And I might put some things up on screen now, but for them to sort of just recently say that and then come out with this, it just seems crazy to me. Like, you as a business, if you want to make a stance, you need to hold to that stance and maintain that same integrity across your service offerings, irrespective of whether or not one thing's considered taboo in one industry and one thing is not. And just quickly here, you can sort of see I've done the Control F. PSA will join CGC by offering pre-grading services meant to remove imperfections in magazines to achieve higher grades. There was some other wording that was mentioned on PSA's website, potentially about cleaning or coloring, but maybe I saw a fake post when it came to that. But right now, it only references pressing itself. But, sort of back to the point I was just alluding to, CGC never did this, and then they started offering it. And, they really can't backtrack now because it's become established. But my point is, PSA just come out and start saying that about cards, which I agree with, right? You should not be altering cards. You should not be cleaning cards or anything like that. So I would have expected them to sort of maintain the same mindset when it came to a new service they're just offering. Because no, it's not them acquiring a company that was already doing that. No, it's not them, sort of already having that maintained within an existing business. It's a new operation from them. So I just would have expected them to say, you know what, we're going to stand by ourselves here. We're going to stand by our integrity. We're going to try and set a new standard because we think we are the best. We're not going to offer pressing on our stuff. And if we do, in fact, see you guys have pressing done to your stuff, we're going to reject it. But, that's not how they're doing it, obviously, because they're looking at it through the lens of making as much money as possible. And that's all well and good for them as a business. That is what they're there to do. They're there to make as much money as possible. But I just would have expected a little bit better. And obviously, they don't want any CGC collectors to sort of avoid them because people want to have their comic books pressed, obviously. So they're going to go to CGC. So PSA obviously wants to remain competitive, but it just comes to the point of, well, you expected the standards to at least be consistent. And maybe, I'm off base for saying that, but I want to hear what you guys, have to say down below, because I just think it's a bit funny, it's a bit rich. And I actually saw a post from Kurt's Card Care actually that I'll bring up now, which I think is perfectly valid. And I'm sort of keen to hear what you guys have to say, so I'm just typing it up now to try and find it again. It's basically here on screen where he sort of circles this, because you can see PSA will offer comic book and magazine pressing to remove defects like bends, creases, dents, and other issues to help ensure the longevity of your items. His post basically says PSA is doing this, but he says, wait, there's more. They're also going to do this. He goes, again, very fair point, like I just alluded to. This is the same company that tells you not to touch your cards and only use a microfiber, but their restoration will ensure longevity, which, again, is a perfectly valid point. And they've dropped the ball here, in my opinion. And I'm just wondering, like I've sort of alluded to quite a lot in recent years, whether or not PSA's stance around card cleaning is going to change. They've had two moments now in the last 12 months to sort of do the right thing. The first one was with that Victor Wembanyama that entered their offices, and the guy shouted out Kurt's Card Care when it got a PSA 10. It was the black one of one from Prism, if I remember correctly. Irrespective of them being able to spot whether or not Kurt's Card Care was actually used, is irrelevant, because my expectations for them would have been, well, you know what, you're a business, you have integrity, you want to be the best of the best, you're seen as the pillar, you classify yourselves as the leader in authentication and grading services. The second you heard those words leave that guy's mouth, you should have decertified that card. And many other collectors, feel the same way. So in my opinion, they failed that test there and there. Then they've just done it again now when they've introduced this comic book and magazine grading. Because irrespective, again, whether it's taboo or not, in comic books, people like it, people use it, people pay for it. CGC's the pillar, they use it. That shouldn't matter to you as PSA, right? You want to maintain your integrity, you want to be that pillar that you often refer to yourself as. You should have said you're not going to offer that service. And you should have backed yourselves. You should have said, you know what? We're not going to do it. We don't care if we can't win that customer base from CGC. We're going to actually win customers off the back of our name and our brand and hard work. We're going to be more affordable. We're going to grade stricter. We're going to set the standard for comic book collectors. But no, you've gone ahead and trying to play both courts, right? And that's not a good thing in any asset of life, or aspect of life, I should say. Rant over, that's sort of it for me today. I'm really keen to hear what you guys have to say down below. Maybe I've missed the point, but I just look at it through that lens. A company trying to play or have their cake and eat it too. It's just ridiculous. So, it is what it is. I think it's really good for the hobby to have more competition now in comic book grading, because like I said, CBCS is not that flash, but it is what it is. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.